Hi, it's Dwyer, gamblersadvisory.com. Here to talk about an upcoming fight at middleweight that is fascinating. It pits 28-year-old UK fighter Matthew Macklin against 39-year-old Ronald Winky Wright. Now, let me backtrack a little bit before I give my prediction. It's no secret here online that I'm a big fan of Bernard Hopkins's. Um, People who follow my videos might remember that I took Hopkins over Kelly Pavlik when he was a big underdog. More recently, I took Hopkins over Jean Pascal in a fight that was a draw officially, and I think he was an underdog in that as well. When Hopkins signed to fight Winky Wright, I was wondering what he saw on film and how he was going to be able to beat Winky Wright, because we forget that Winky Wright thoroughly dominated Felix Trinidad. I don't think Trinidad won a round in that fight. He thoroughly dominated Shane Mosley. And these are fighters who, I admired. Was surprised to see them dominated systematically without being knocked out, without being staggered. These guys were systematically broken down, technically outboxed. Ike Quartey, one of my favorite fighters, looked very bad against Winky Wright. So when Bernard Hopkins signed to fight Wright, I was wondering what exactly is Bernard going to do. Understand, Winky Wright is a fighter who's right-hand dominant, who fights out of a left-hand stance. I know using terms like converted southpaw gets a little tricky depending on whether you're talking about a guy going from lefty to righty or righty to lefty. Here you have a righty going to lefty, right? That jab that you see Winky Wright punching guys with is actually his lead hand. So that's how he batters you, right? There's not much of a left hand to go with the right hand. He goes around the ring bludgeoning you, and he's aggressive. So when he fought Jermaine Taylor in a fight in which I thought he got robbed, that fight was officially ruled a draw, but I thought he got robbed. You'll notice that several times in that fight, he actually backed Taylor into a corner. And keep in mind, Winky Wright isn't really a true middleweight. He's actually fought most of his fights at lighter weights, right? So I was sitting down and I was wondering exactly what Bernard Hopkins had in mind. I knew Hopkins couldn't allow himself to get hit with Winky Wright's jab. He couldn't be at the end of the jab because he would then end up like Felix Trinidad, Shane Mosley, and Ike Quartey. So I thought that Hopkins was going to try to stay outside of the jab, but I was wondering how he's going to be able to maintain distance since Winky actually does move around the ring somewhat. Well, of course, the first round of that fight, and it's on YouTube, and I would encourage you to look at it, is one of Hopkins's best rounds of his entire career. And that first round has the blueprint on how to beat Winky Wright. I believe it also has the blueprint on how to beat any converted jabber who has his dominant hand out front, has a tight defense, right? Winky Wright has a Marlon Starling very tight defense, has a tight defense, is impossible to hit, and operates out of a shell. I believe Sergio Martinez should be able to use this blueprint in his fight against Sergei Zinzuruk in a few months. What Bernard Hopkins did, and it's masterful. Just look at Winky Wright's jab and see how it's handled. Bernard goes from being outside the jab, right? And he does it the way Hopkins does it, bouncing laterally. Never looks like he's running. He's outside the jab. Then when Winky gets close, Hopkins literally is able to leap in and tie him up, right? In between there, Hopkins will throw a couple of punches, but the mastery of Bernard Hopkins is even when Winky Wright has his hand extended, his jab hand, his lead hand, Hopkins was able to come in and tie him up. And of course, Hopkins does so at angles where he's keeping Winky Wright turning, he's keeping Winky Wright moving, he's keeping Winky Wright uncomfortable. Now, Matthew Macklin has the athleticism. He's the younger man. He's the better athlete. He's the stronger man in this fight. He has the athleticism to do a lot of great things. Here's the problem. He doesn't have the knowledge. Go back and look at his fights. You're going to see that Macklin, who is an offensive fighter, right? He, can take you out to the body. He can take you out up top. Has a greater than 60% knockout ratio. But you're going to see that Macklin, who can move around the ring, doesn't know how to tie up his opponent like Bernard Hopkins does. Right? Macklin occasionally will tie up his opponent, but he can't clinch like Bernard Hopkins. And things like clinches that look like they're just breaks between fighting are actually some of the most important skills in boxing. So since Macklin doesn't clinch, and since Macklin doesn't move a lot laterally, he fights you by being right in front of you, right? He'll stay outside, then he'll come inside, and then the problem is he'll then stay inside, right? Macklin tends to be in shootouts because he can't clinch like Bernard Hopkins, because he doesn't have that level of understanding is the only word that comes to mind about how to break the tempo and rhythm of his opponent. I'm taking Winky Wright in this fight. It's incredibly dangerous because keep in mind, Winky Wright is more than 10 years older than Matthew Macklin. Winky Wright also has not fought in close to 2 years. And to further compound the problem, Winky Wright, after losing the Bernard Hopkins fight, lost to Paul Williams and hasn't fought since. He's in the middle of a 2-fight losing streak. So I'm assuming in this video that Winky Wright has kept himself in shape and is prepared to fight. You'd be surprised to learn. Let me just look at my notes for a second. You'd be surprised to learn that Winky Wright has only had 2 fights since calendar year 2006. Right? So I'm hoping that Winky Wright is a professional and shows up as Winky Wright and not as an old man who can only remind us of who he was, like Paul Briggs did against Danny Green, right? If Winky Wright shows up, and it's a big if, and gamblers, all I can say is be careful on this fight. Be very careful because Macklin is a young lion. But if Winky Wright shows up as Winky Wright, right, and not as an old man, right? If Winky shows up like people like Bernard Hopkins have been showing up in fights, well preserved, well trained, not a problem with weight, has studied his opponent, is there not just for the payday but for the win, in fact might even harbor fantasies of once again getting a title. If that Winky Wright shows up, I believe that he's going to find Macklin at the end of his jab after 2 rounds, because Macklin always seems to fall into a pattern. And I believe he's going to find Macklin at the end of his jab after 2 rounds. I believe Macklin is going to have a very hard time hitting Wright either to the head or the body, because Wright's defense is kind of like Andre Kotelnik's, right? They have their hands all up and down their body. There's not a lot of surface space to hit, right? And I believe that Macklin is going to be unable to deal with Winky Wright's shell defense. Let me also point out, too, Paul Williams. I know I've ignored that fight. I don't believe that fight applies here because Paul Williams is very tall, fights tall, something Macklin does not do, throws a very high volume of punches, And one of the ways to beat a counterpuncher is to simply overwhelm them, right? And Paul Williams stuck a jab on Winky Wright from distance, had physical tools that don't apply in this fight, threw a volume that's far greater than what Matthew Macklin throws in his fights, right? Macklin can't, in one training camp, suddenly decide that he's going to show up and throw 100 punches around, because that would wreak havoc with his stamina, right? Not only that, if you suddenly try to fight tall after a career of fighting crouched over and brawling, then you're going to throw your center of gravity off. That's something you don't want to do in combat, when you might get hit and you might be off balance as it is, even in your normal stance, right? So I don't believe Macklin can fight like Paul Williams. I don't think Macklin can fight like Bernard Hopkins. I think what we're going to see is a fight more akin to Winky against Shane Mosley, Winky against Felix Trinidad. Keep in mind, Trinidad, very offensive fighter. You saw the Trinidad against Ricardo Mayorga tape. He's very offensive. When he got in with Winky Wright and started getting hit with a stiff jab that's actually Winky's dominant hand, uh, Trinidad's offense went out the window, right? When you're getting hit in the face and you can't set, and the other guy has the jab time to the point where he can just literally hit you, even when you're throwing a punch, and he has the kind of defense where he can get close to you without getting hit, that's going to take the offense right out of Matthew Macklin's game. I like Winky Wright in this fight. Let me point out, too, I do not know the odds of this fight. I do not see Matthew Macklin winning a decision from Winky Wright. If you're going to straddle this play, then my recommendation is to take Winky to win the fight. I'm sure Winky's the underdog. Take Winky to win the fight. I would straddle it against Matthew Macklin by KO. Even though I don't think Macklin can get a KO, I believe that's the only way he can win the fight. Let me know what you think. Leave your comments for me here on YouTube. Visit us at gamblersadvisory.com. And don't be afraid at all to disagree with me, because I know I'm taking a guy who literally is only fighting his third fight since 2006. Thanks for watching.